Good afternoon and welcome to our third webinar in our Designing Homes for those sensory differences. This is the Robust Housing webinar. I'm Becca, I work for Neurodiverse Connection. Claire, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, I'm Claire Skidmore. I'm the National Strategic Housing Lead in the Learning Disability and Autism Programme, NHS England, and we've been working really closely with Neurodiverse Connection to run this series of webinars together, and this is the third of 4.
We at Neurodiverse Connection are committed to promoting the use of neurodivergent affirming language. We have a guide to neurodivergent affirming language available in our resource library. And however, please note that in these webinars, as with any content we host or share that has input from other organisations, we cannot guarantee that the preferred neurodivergent affirming terminology is always used. So, we are going to start today with a pre-recorded film, a conversation between Richard Maguire, Jules O'Brien, and Jill Corbin. So Jill Corbin works at Neurodiverse Connection. They are the founder, and you may have seen them at our previous webinars. Richard Maguire is a Neurodiverse Connection associate who works with autistic people and people with a learning disability. He is also an experienced trainer, speaker, and author, and he shares his experience of being autistic from a lived experience perspective. Jules O'Brien is a grandmother to a young man who has been supported to live in his own home. Jules is a nurse and has held a range of senior household roles in her professional life. So, without further ado, we are going to hand over to Jules, Richard, and Jill for this conversation.
Welcome, Jules and Richard. I'm Jill Corbin, I'm Director at Neurodiverse Connection, and really happy to be chatting with you both today. Jules, can I invite you to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jules O'Brien. I am William's maternal grandmother, and we'll be talking about William today. Above everything else, I'm a wife, a mum, and a grandmum, but professionally, I did qualify as a nurse.
Thanks, Jules. And Richard?
I'm Richard Maguire. I've worked with William for some time now. I'm actually an autistic adult with an autistic family, etc. Worked in the field since the mid-80s, but I first heard about William at a health and wellbeing review, that was it. And I heard about a young teenager who was been in the hospital for a long time, and it really wasn't appropriate. And it was how does he leave? And that was 2.5 years before he actually did leave. And I was involved again in a couple of care and treatment reviews. It was always the same thing. He needs to leave, and perfectly nice young man is all right. You know, he can make it. You don't need what the environment is in. Anyway, he has left, and through Neurodiverse Connection, I've carried on working with William, training and advising staff and providing feedback that I hope the staff working with him will find useful.
Great, Richard, thanks so much. And Jules, would you be able to give us a bit of a summary, an overview of William's situation and his story?
William's story started when he was a baby, really, and he was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2. He lived at home until he was 6, and when he was 6, his mental health broke down. We're none the wiser as to why that happened, but he changed rapidly and became quite violent, angry. His behaviours were different in that he wouldn't wear shoes, wouldn't go to his bedroom, wouldn't eat if people watched him. There were lots of changes that concerned his parents, and he went into a respite unit for some further observation, and sadly has not been home since. He moved to a school environment, a boarding school environment for children with autism, but again, sadly, that placement broke down when the staff weren't able to cope with William. And then William was sectioned and taken to hospital when he was 10 years old. And he finally left the hospital at the grand old age of 17 and about 3/4 when he moved to his own home. which is much closer to family, which means that Mum, myself, and his sister can go and visit regularly, and he seems to have settled really well.
Thanks, Jules. And when I first met William, he was in long-term segregation in hospital. Could you tell us a little bit about that situation and about the environment that he was living in there?
Yeah, I mean, when he first went to the hospital, they didn't really have anywhere to put William, and they found sort of a room with an observation panel, and he was there for about a year, and then he moved to a large ward area. However, he wasn't able to be on the ward area, so he was in a segregation unit to the side. It was fairly bright and airy, but very, very small. Then they had adult patients were going to use the ward, and they felt it wasn't appropriate for William to be on that ward anymore. So they moved him into a house in the grounds. Unfortunately, it was not suitable for his needs. It was very small, very cramped. His rooms were small, it was dark, and because it had large bay windows on it, because they moved him very quickly, they just boarded the windows. The hallway where the staff observed William from was small and cramped, and when we visited as family, we'd have to sit on the stairs, talk to William through a partly closed door. It wasn't a nice environment at all to be in. Very, very restrictive for William. He couldn't move freely around the property either, which meant that he spent the majority of his time in his room.
Thanks, Jules. And Richard, I know that you and I actually visited this property together, and I remember I really struggled with the environment, and actually particularly the lighting. Actually, I really struggled to get home that day after being in that building. But can I ask you to say a little bit more about your experience of the building and the suitability or unsuitability of the environment, William?
Yeah, I can see why they did it. It was a building had on the property, but it's what, an 1870s gatekeeper's lodge. And well, I live in an 1870s house. The rooms are all small and square. Not a real problem, but if you're providing a service for a young man who's got a lot of energy and you're putting staff in it, it's too cramped. There's much too. And I can remember that thin corridor. I remember the rooms, and I was thinking, the staff were saying they needed 5 people to move William from one room to another. I'm thinking, you don't, you just need a space that he can operate in. I'm sure any difficulties he would have moving from room to room would simply be overload noise and being cramped. It's this sensory and too many people around, too much room to process. So I think he'd got resigned to being in one room. Yeah, it was the building was tricky. I mean, I think I met members of staff in there who were trying to make the best of it. But having to work with a hospital system that was very risk averse, would really want things done in a certain way. And I think the staff were not entirely on board with it, but doing what they were told to do. But it was all these people that needed to be there, and the rigidity and the routines around it. Where was this teenage young man going to grow? How would he flourish? He's a teenager. And the other thing too, I noticed too, a lot of staff had the appreciation he is a teenager. Teenagers get stuff wrong, correct? They were kind of okay with it, but it was sort of a very much a top-down thing. It's a hospital thing. The person concerned just has to be a patient and has to do as they're told, and they're only okay if they're not doing anything very much. And I just remember one time at a CPR, I was with him, and he mentioned going to the on-site cafe at this place, and he would go, and do you know, at the drop of a hat, I just said, I just taken him there, one-on-one, me and William, I'd just gone. If we'd have found things too much, I've just dealt with it. I'm used to this. Don't make a drama out of a crisis. Don't make a fuss. And I just tried what I can do to help him succeed. But I was reasonably confident we could get there and back. He could get something that he liked. And it was a real sense that the building itself was as confined as the culture, the hospital culture that had been built around this young teenage man who got a real zest for life, and it is really interesting. So yes, it was hard to witness, I think. Yeah.
And Richard, I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you particularly the language wrapped in cotton wool, and I think that that was describing the overall approach. But actually there was a kind of a literal wrapping of the building. Richard, can I ask you your reflections on why that happened, and you know, was it helpful? What might have been different?
Yes, I mean the building itself, the rooms that were Williams had blue plastic padding in them, so floor and walls. I understood from members of staff at the hospital it's because of self-harm or banging him into things or just hurting himself. And I was thinking, when I'm doing it right now, you can't see it, but right now I'm squeezing my two hands against the desk, two hard points you get in location. And I've noticed William, what he needs is to use hard points that he can just tap into like that, or bang, or just hold to get a location. You see a lot of autistic people going through doors, touching the door. You need location. He says, "Oh, that's a nice hard point there." And I'm thinking William needs hard points. They've made it all soft, and of course, if you're given like Jules just said about his emotions and the way he was working, yes, of course, if you give him a hard point, chances are he would use it very hard. And so it was this risk aversion. So they wrapped him up without the sensory input that he could have needed. Again, trying not to hurt himself, but also it often, I don't know if it was understood, was his need for banging against things. You do that. I think he does like that, but he's not trying to hurt himself. There's a sense of regulation, there's a sense of location, there's a real sense of calmness if you can find hard points to reference against. And I think they were taken away from him. And I did see, you know, when he was there, I remember his sitting on his bed in there. I remember his body, his stance. He was trying to curve around. He was trying to get that feedback I think hard points would have given him. And he was under the blankets trying to get it, but he was doing his best to get the regulation through his body. And if you think about it, a lot of us do. I mean, clicking pens and things, that's hard points, Tim.
Yeah.
We've all got it, but they've kind of taken it all away from him, thinking he might harm himself.
I think the bed was made of foam with plastic covering. Floor was foam, plastic covering. The walls were foam with plastic covering. So you're absolutely right, Richard. There were no hard points for him at all. And it was the most, I know that William can become overstimulated and that can be very difficult for him. But there was nothing. It was plain. There was no point that would stimulate him at all to perhaps just turn and look or feel there was something of interest in the room. And I'm not saying there should have been lots of pictures on the wall and lots of games for him to play and toys, because he doesn't like that. He doesn't like the clutter in his room. But there was just nothing. And that was very difficult. You know, sometimes when he had a magazine, they come with stickers, and he used to stick the stickers on the wall, and it made me think actually he does want some little point of interest there, some reference to something that he's done, or some colour or something, just so that he's got something different to look at, to be perfectly honest. Because, you know, I felt that the big problem was keeping him in such a low stimulation environment meant that after a long time, the slightest thing could overstimulate him really quickly, because they'd not built up that resilience to the stimulation around him.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. So much that's happens with autism work is people try with the best of intentions to remove all stimulation, but you need some of it. It's learn how to deal with it and learn where
I
you
learned
sit
a
with
lot
things.
from your training, Richard. That's the thing. That was a really interesting session, because trying to hear from an autistic person how it feels to be autistic is really different than somebody observing someone. I can't possibly understand those feelings, but when somebody tells me about them, I've got a better understanding than I had previously, and that's really helped, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, being autistic, I find William quite readable. I think he finds me readable, because there's something we both commonly understand. Yeah.
And Jules, tell us about, so actually I'd love to talk more about the transition and Richard's input and involvement in that. And I think we're short on time, so perhaps we can have another session. But tell us about William's environment now, and a little bit about his life now.
His environment is still padded and his furniture's still soft, but there's much more of it. There's more there are more things in the room. There's his bouncing balls and things like that that you can sit on. He's in a room where the television is. He's not trying to squint at something through a doorway, or he has access to other areas of the house. He has recently been in the kitchen, which is obviously not padded, which is really great, and helped to get his own breakfast. He's got a garden area that you can go out to with a trampoline because William loves to bounce. And it's much more spacious. He's got a nice large lounge area. The doors all do lock, and one of the good things is that William can get time on his own there if he needs it, because even when he's in the hospital, if he wanted time alone, he'd shut the door, but the staff were right outside that door looking at him. In this property, he can go into his bedroom, tell everybody to clear out, and they go into the hallway, so he's got a buffer of the sitting room before his bedroom, so he can have privacy. We all need privacy. He usually vocalizes. He'll say, "Get out," and people would just leave the room. If he's feeling very tense, he may not vocalize, he might charge, but then the staff know that if William charges, we need to leave the room. He needs his space. He wants us to go, and that's what they do. And they go and they wait until William's ready for them to go back in. I've seen him lounging on the sofas. I've seen him doing what lots of teenagers do, which is lounging on the floor with his iPad. And to see him doing those things, which I've seen my teenagers do growing up, is a fantastic feeling, because he's no longer just sat very lonely on a square foam bed in the middle of a blue room. He's actually moving around and doing things and engaging and being able to say, "I've had enough, all of you go away," or "all of you come here." He looks different. His whole attitude is different. He looks healthier. He looked quite pasty and bloated. Now he looks really fit and healthy. He's a big lad, but he's fit and healthy. I don't know if you've noticed the difference in him physically, Richard.
Oh, very much, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's lovely to see a very clean, dapper, healthy young man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's what he should be.
And you know, he goes to the bathroom and his hygiene is well looked after, but there isn't the hassle and the tussle that there was at the hospital, where there would be 5 people getting him into a shower. And they're taking things very steady with him. The staff are having to learn to ease off the pedal, that if they go in full pelt, that William will be overstimulated, dysregulate, and want to disengage. That's been hard for the staff, I think, because they absolutely adore him and they want to get on. Now, let's get him out there. Let's do this. Let's do that. And oh no, we can't. We need to back away a little bit. And very occasionally they forget, and William will become dysregulated. But in the main, he's been doing really, really well.
Thanks, Jules. And Richard, I really want to hear your reflections on the environment. I know before William moved, you visited his home, and that
Yes.
you've been working with him since.
Mm.
And I'm thinking about people who might be watching this,
Yeah.
families, commissioners, who might be thinking, you know, but you know, maybe we need to be padding, or to use padding, or how do we get this right?
Mm.
What are your reflections on what's been important for William in the environment? And you know, for Pete, I know you've worked also with other people who perhaps have done damage to property or have hurt themselves, or perhaps there've been injuries to staff who've been supporting them.
Mm.
Can you share some of your experience and learning
Okay.
about those
Yeah.
themes?
One of the things is, I mean, I've over the years, especially in the 80s and 90s, was helping a lot of people move out of hospital who got all sorts of things. And the kind of environments that people build today weren't known about then. You just went from ordinary to ordinary. And in terms of a robust environment, things I would say don't do is a stud work wall. And Williams attested the resilience of one of them. But that's just because it's bound. It is a stud work wall here, and I could put my fist through that. It's old Victorian plaster, bricks and mortar, nice and firm, proper door frames, decent wood doors, and nice carpets. You're kind of there. You don't necessarily have to reproduce a hospital outside, and I know what's been done for Williams Home, and so the things that do work is it's bigger, lighter, more space. But the thing I think that really has worked is it's the organisation looking after William have a social care, not a health ethos. So they're not trying to fix anything. They're helping him grow as the young man that he is. And I am moved, often quite emotional, actually, with proper emotion, of how sensitive they are with him. They know not to contain him like a malfunctioning thing. Is a young man growing? And I do particularly have a whole lot of respect for the manager in there too, who is very keen to have the right people in there, the right humans working with William, and also is again with the environment and getting it right, the culture has got tons of ideas, but knows about metering the ideas and the progression to what William can deal with. But those sorts of things work much better than a robust environment. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, don't do silly stuff that's obviously dangerous, and things like ledges they can jump off and that kind of thing, sort that kind of stuff out. But I've worked with a lot of people coming out of hospitals in very ordinary environments, and they also like to be trusted. And yes, we have had some people that dysregulate massively, but generally in most environments, I'm actually surprised how little harm damage they do. Does that make sense? Yes, you got to rearrange the room. Yes, stuff gets upturned, but treat it, I think, just for what it is. Yeah, they've got too much for you.
I think all children, when they're children, can do that. I remember William's mother turning over all the chairs and knocking everything off of a unit when she got really cross. And then afterwards I looked at it and I said, okay, you're going to help mummy to pick it all up now. And she did. William's not had that opportunity to learn. She learned from that and she didn't do it, not to that degree again. But all children go through those learning curves. You learn that if you jump off of something a little bit too high, you hurt yourself and it hurts. And but William again doesn't have the opportunities to do that. So I think now he can get out into the garden. The staff can start trusting their instincts a little bit more and give him a little bit more risk. As time goes on, we may find that his environment will change with William as he learns more, as he becomes more confident with life, that they'll be able to change his environment to suit his need as and when. You also have to manage family expectations as well. Do know that if things aren't right for William, how things can go very, very wrong. So we need our risks managed to a degree as well. So we need to take small steps to ensure that William and his staff are safe, because his staff are so important. And as you said, Richard, they're a really fantastic group of people. Fiona and I interviewed the manager ourselves, which was great that they allowed us to do that. And we interviewed some of the staff. We helped to write the person specs for the staff in the unit. So it's great that we've had that input and that the staff are working well. They're very precious to us because of what they do for William. They're doing things that we can't be there to do. So we want them to stay. We want, for William's sake, to have consistency. We want them to be looked after. So for us as well, we have to take small steps in trust with the staff and with William.
I know you were saying this about robust environments, but actually just what you've outlined is more important than the robust environment. It's the culture and the relationships. And it's a relationship they're helping William have with himself, because every time I go there, every few weeks I'm in there and I see what I call more William. There's a bit more, there's some more showing, the status, he's growing.
What is a robust environment? It's a mixture of everything, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, you can have you can have the house can be robust, yes. William can't hurt himself, he's wrapped in cotton wool, but can he grow? No. There's got to be that mixture of all of those things coming together. He's got to be safe while he's growing, but he's got to also learn to take risks. He's got to be cared for. He's got to be understood. He's got to be allowed the freedom to have his own space. And he's got to be able to set the pace which is right for him, so that he doesn't feel overwhelmed by everything. And I think that's what a robust home is. It's not just the bricks and mortar and the fixtures and fittings. It has to be a whole package.
I think, yeah, you summed it up perfectly. That's just right. Yeah.
I think the one thing you have to remember is people can go into a house, a new home. You've designed this house around what you think is their needs, because we can only think it's their needs because we're not inside them fully understanding. And because William wasn't as verbal as some people, it may be difficult to design a home around what exactly it is that they want. They can go in, and at first it's all very new, and he's got to explore, he's got to learn. And he's been through that now for the 6 months. He's now going into the settling in period, and he's now starting to chill down a little bit. And it's divine. It's divine to see it.
I'm going to pause our conversation. It's been beautiful and moving and really interesting. And thank you both so much for your reflections and your contributions. And Jules, thank you for sharing with us about William's life and his experience. I just want to share a couple of reflections in kind of wrap up. And one is I feel really moved to have been part of this discussion, but also to have been like a small part of William's journey. Yeah, it's been really transformative, I think, in so many ways. And one of the things that I notice in working with autistic people is that so often our dysregulation is viewed as the norm because we're autistic, rather than understanding that actually we're people who are struggling and dysregulated and haven't had our needs understood and met. And it's been yeah, a really beautiful thing to see that understanding shift, in part through the work that Richard's done, and in what you shared as a family about your hopes and aspirations and holding on to William as a human, not as a kind of as a set of behaviours or a diagnosis or a problem, but actually really holding on to his humanity and the strength and the beauty and the things that you know and love in him. And the other thing that really stands out to me is how complex systems are, and how often in complex systems people are blamed or labelled as being complex, whereas actually it's the situation and the people around them that haven't understood them and their needs. And you know, Richard, I heard you say, you know, I see William and I just get him. Like this makes sense. Of course, in this circumstance, this is, you know, where his needs aren't being met, or he's not been understood, or he hasn't had this opportunity. Of course, this is a situation, but it doesn't have to be like this. And the final reflection, and kind of coming back to this idea of a robust home, I really hear and believe that culture and relationships are more important than the building, and that the right building can really support and enable good outcomes. And that often what I've observed is that where we don't understand someone and we don't meet their needs, we identify a risk and we put more staff in, and actually that adds to the risk rather than taking away. And so then we have to become more restrictive and more restrictive and more restrictive. And to pause and to take a step back and to take an autism informed approach actually can be really transformative. Yeah, so what often when I'm speaking to people around buildings, you know, the way I see it is like some of the challenges of building can be the thing that overloads us and takes away some of our tolerance. And actually simple things like turning out the lights, like shutting the door between the person and the fridge, you know, reducing some of that background noise and some of that sensory input can enable us to regulate and can support much better outcomes. So I think, you know, there are really small changes we can make that can make a big difference.
I think we have to remember though that all of the environments that we're in, I'm sitting here now in my sitting room with my things around me, how I want them arranged, the colours that I want. My chairs are in the places that I want them. I've made all those decisions. Exactly the same for you, Jill. Exactly the same for you, Richard. William hasn't got to that point yet.
No.
But he will have his own environment because he will design it. He will grow and he'll say, move that chair over there, or I don't like that chair, let's get another chair. Or he will start to have his own environment that he owns. And if he wants a hard surface there so that he can push down if he needs to, he'll have one. And I think that what he's got now is the seeds to that growing. He's been given that home and he can now use that to move forward. And I think that's really interesting how we're all very, very different. William's no different to the rest of us. He's going to want his home to be what his home is.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What a great place to leave it. So thank you both so much for your time.
Wonderful. So thank you to Richard, Jill, and Jules for that. We are now going to move over to a presentation by Diane, Chandler, and Karen Flatt. A little bit about them before we start. So Karen is an architect, studio director, and the mental health leader Arcadis, specializing in mental health design. And Diane is the lead occupational therapist at East Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust and was part of the team that developed the Safe Home Environmental Tool. So that's SHEA, SHEA, and that aims to identify the key design elements that need to be considered as part of a capable environment assessment. So I am going to hand over to Diane and Karen.
Well, first of all, that was such a powerful film and there was so much in that. I was scribbling down notes in terms of kind of William's experience, actually. And I wanted to start with a piece of co-production we did within Sussex Partnership Trust with our team Springwell, who are all a team that worked with the trust. And it was looking at, actually, we did a piece of work over 2 years about what makes a home, because we were very aware that we were involved in some projects about designing homes for people. And we, as touched on in that film, actually, we didn't know how to get people's views in terms of how they wanted their homes to look and feel. And I think the information we did in that project kind of fits in so nicely with some of the themes touched on in the film. We did a piece of work over about 2 years. We met every fortnight over a very long period. Sometimes it was during COVID and we had to go from face-to-face to online. But I think in the 2 years we all worked together, it's fair to say nobody ever said, I want my home to be robust. It wasn't ever a word that people actually ever said. But when we looked at all the things about people's experiences of living in their homes, it actually, the concept of robustness did come into what makes a home feel like a home. And I've just put up some of the kind of slides that came up with the graphic facilitation we had, because one of the things particularly was when houses weren't built to a very good specification, things like lack of robustness did have an impact on people, and especially things like the acoustics within homes, when people were living in perhaps a shared home with bedrooms next door to somebody who liked to make a lot of noise. They might be very noise sensitive. So there were lots of elements actually about a home that did kind of feed into this idea about a well-designed home can actually is better than one that isn't, really. At the crux of everything, as was mentioned really with William, is there's often a very, very tricky balancing act between getting the safety of the individual and a care team, for instance, considered, but also how does it feel for somebody like William living in that home, and what does the design of the home need to be like to meet that person's needs and facilitate. I think it was touched on really nicely there about giving somebody the freedom to grow, that we might start out with a kind of a home that's got some restrictions in place, but there should always be that sense of how can we reduce some of those restrictions going forward as people settle within their new home environment. If they've been, for instance, in hospital, experience a lot of restrictions, and the very idea that he was living in what was essentially a padded environment from the sound of it, to, you know, how do you then give people the opportunity to have their own home and their own kind of sense of that home for them. And I'm talking largely from my clinical experience of working as an occupational therapist, looking at designing homes for people coming out of hospital. And there are challenges, I think, in terms of making sure you've got the right home specification with the right person. So we don't want to kind of over design an environment so that it's overly restrictive. But we also need to understand what specific adaptations we may need to think about. And also, I think from years of doing this, it's understanding what do we mean by robust? And I think there's so many different definitions, interpretations, and we all have our kind of understanding what that might mean. And I think one of the key things I've learned over the years is that having the right people around the table at the right time, those people who really know their individual well, like Jules was saying, and there's her experience of working, knowing William and Richard. So having like that kind of representation of knowing the individual, but also from a perspective of like the clinical team and what's going to be needed to keep that person safe within whatever home you have planned. And I think we've learned as well that having the right products in place for the person, but then that are fitted by the people who actually know how to do that is also really important, because we spend a lot of time when things go wrong replacing elements, and it can end up getting very costly and be hugely disruptive on the individual if you've got workmen constantly coming in having to replace things because either they were the wrong product to start with or they weren't actually fitted properly. One thing we did within Sussex Partnership Trust was develop what we call the Safe Home Environment Tool, the SHEER. And the sole intention of us designing this, it was a very pragmatic thing we did when we were being asked largely by commissioners actually to give advice on the types of buildings that they should be looking at for individuals in terms of, developing at home. And we were at a loss to kind of understand how to make those kind of decisions, like do you buy a bungalow and convert it? Do we need a new build? So we developed the tool really as a pragmatic way of gathering kind of information, not just on what the situation might be for somebody like William now, but some of the things that might have gone wrong in the past or things that might be important to them from a sensory point of view, to make sure we had best kind of specification of the actual physical environment. But as was touched on in that film, having the right staff with the right skills and the right support package is the key bit. And the physical environment is an element of that. It's not the only thing we need to think about. One of the themes when we started looking at sort of doing some design specifications for people was destruction and damage to property was a theme that came up, not with everybody, but with certain smaller number of people. This was something that we really had to think about where we were being asked about what would a robust environment be for that person. And I always say that in a transition meeting this week, where we were talking about somebody living in their own family home, actually, where there'd been a lot of damage to the family home. The key thing was trying to understand why that's happening. Is the person in pain? Are they frustrated? What are we not understanding that's leading them possibly to be communicating some of their distress through this? But we have learned, unfortunately, that when we get it wrong, it can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences, actually, which both can lead to harm to the individual and also risk to others. And the example on the right, which is an environment that was flooded every single day, was because the person just loved a shower. He loved being in the water. It was something they did to kind of soothe themselves. It was something they did, that sensory stimulation. But because that hadn't been thought through in terms of the actual environment, the flooding and the damage, that wasn't because they were distressed. They were actually having a great time, but the consequences led to this kind of damage to actually the rest of the property. That if we'd have known and considered earlier on, we could have thought about kind of creative solutions for this. And I love the comment in the William film about the stud wall. Sometimes the things that we get wrong are relatively easy to fix and understand, and aren't actually going to impact necessarily on the design of the feel of the home. So things like having better build quality, things like like you say, not having these plaster walls that can get damaged relatively easily and look very unsightly very quickly. So some of the things we've seen as well, that there are areas of the home that seem to be more prone to getting damaged, and just finding solutions around. So kitchens, things like how do we promote independence, plan for somebody developing skills, but actually not make an environment so overwhelming too soon. So things like, do we have an open plan access? Do we have a kitchen that somebody can access with support? All those things we try to kind of look at as part of our safe home environment specification. But these are some of the things that can go wrong, that can really not only impact on that person's well-being, but can be some of the things that might then lead, unfortunately, to people needing to come back into hospital. And things like not even thinking about, well, what if somebody likes throwing things? That would have been easily remedied if we'd have thought about things like having toughened glass in certain windows within the home. So the things that just can get overlooked, then that can have real consequences for the sustainability of a home for somebody in the future. And like I say, readmission to hospital is something we all want to avoid. So getting it right from the beginning is a really key thing in planning a discharge from hospital into somebody's own home. One of the things we've found that can go wrong is when we don't have a shared agreement about what specification needs to look like for somebody. And that's something we need to get right very, very early in the planning process. But also this is a really good example of where things can get lost in the process. So this was somebody where we knew we needed to not have radiators in their home. We knew this would be a risky, area for them, and we planned underfloor heating. And when we did our first site visit, the radiators had been fitted against the spec, actually. But the builders were very confident and said, "Don't worry, love, we've built you some covers for your radiators." This was damaged within 5 minutes of the person walking through the door. They'd had a very, very stressful transfer from a hospital miles away. They'd been in the kind of ambulance for 5 hours. They hadn't even got their coat off. You can imagine how kind of stressed and anxious they must have been feeling. And this is what happened. So sometimes it's like, if we'd have followed that spec better along the process, these kind of things wouldn't have happened. And we were just saying, these are the things when we don't fully understand and communicate what we mean by robust. All of these things, the damage we've seen here, could have been so easily avoided if we'd had a better shared understanding about what that needed to look like for this individual. And I think these are some of the things that we see can go wrong quite easily that aren't integral to how that home looks and feels. It's some of the fixtures and fittings, like having doors that are fitted correctly, that are the right door in the right place. Kitchen, again, I've mentioned, there's a good example of this. Is a really actually beautifully designed kitchen, but it was just too overwhelming. It was too much too soon for that individual. And this is the before, and I can flick onto the after. This is the kitchen was literally dismantled overnight by this individual because they just didn't, it was too much. And I think we'd have been better if we'd have understood that and had the fixtures and fittings in place, so we could have gradually graded that as they settled. We could have added elements, so we could have added the cooker and the hob, and we could have started with a very kind of basic, access to making drinks, a small fridge. We could have built up from that if we'd have, rather than the whole kitchen all at once. And this is sometimes something we see that goes wrong with open plan designs, or can go wrong. And I think this is just another example of literally all what was left of this kitchen. And this wasn't done in distress. I think the client wasn't angry. They weren't it was really about them just not being able to cope with that sensory, too much within their environment.
Thanks, Diane. So I'm Karen Flatt. I'm an architect and a specialist in mental health care design at Arcadis, and I've been designing environments for people with mental health issues for the last, well, nearly 25 years, and covering all different types of accommodation, whether it's secure inpatient, then education buildings, people who might have eating disorders and refurbishments, dementia, supported living environments, neurodisability, community mental health, there's lots of them, acute mental health buildings, children's homes, and also environments for people with learning disabilities, whether that's inpatient hospital accommodation, or along with my colleagues who specialise in supported living accommodation as well in the housing sector. But with all of those different types of buildings, one of the things that we do on every single project is we talk to the people who are actually going to use the building, and we, with them, through a series of workshops, we look at key areas and how they want to feel in the building, what will make them feel in a certain way, what colours they would like, what artwork, what furniture, all of those things. So we bring that whole co-production process into our designs. And this is a little seesaw on the screen at the moment. And this is one of the conundrums with working in this sector is, as Richard and Jules said earlier, and as Diane has said as well, we want to create the most therapeutic and lovely environment that we can for whoever's going to be living or residing in a building. But we also want to make it as safe as possible. And trying to find the balance between these two can be really, really difficult. And one of the things that I've found is that we end up with possibly lovely therapeutic environments on one hand, and then maybe a safe, what we might call a lovely environment on the other hand. And really, we've got to try and find a balance for some of these buildings. And the term robust comes up quite a lot in mental health environments, whether it's in a hospital accommodation or in a home environment. If you look the word robust up in the dictionary, it says not showing weakness or uncertainty. And if you're at home, you can go and buy various products, things that you might like in your own home, and you would describe those probably as homely. But on the other hand, there are specialist products on the market, like these kind of products, which you might see more in a hospital environment. And these are super robust, or they claim to be, but you probably think they were institutional, and you might not necessarily want them in a home environment. I certainly wouldn't want some of those things in my home. And then robust as well, the definition of it, or a synonym for the crossword lovers who might be listening, is, you know, that we want something that's solid, strong, firm, sturdy and tough, which, you know, I don't think anybody would argue that, you know, you'd want your furniture and fittings and your environment to last and be solid and strong, so you don't have to replace things. This is a picture of a seating unit that's in an environment that I visited a few years ago. What you could say about that piece of furniture is all of the things along the bottom of the screen there in the green, but actually those words are actually synonyms again of concrete. And this building, this is a secure children's home. The only material that was found that was indestructible was concrete. So all of the bedroom furniture was built out of concrete, which I found absolutely shocking. Yes, it's very tough, but it's not very homely, and it's not the kind of environment I would like in a care environment. But they had got to the point where they couldn't find anything else that would withstand some of the challenging behaviour and destructive behaviours that were happening in that home. And it's difficult from an architectural perspective, because there aren't specific regulations that cover robustness. So as architects, we have to make sure we are complying with building regulations for all building types, and also the British standards. There are some specialist specifications and testing standards that the loss prevention standard covers, but they are things like roller shutters and grills. They are things about protecting buildings from people breaking in, and not necessarily at all about creating a home and a safe environment. One of the differences between a home specification and a healthcare specification is that there are differences that we have to comply with in a healthcare setting. There's health building notes. There's other guidance that is the Royal College of Psychiatrists guidance. They are just guidance notes, but there is also what are called health technical memoranda, which are mandatory technical guidance, like the building regs, that we have to comply with for hospitals. And some of those cover acoustics, but they also cover fire. And the acoustics one is quite an interesting one, because in hospital accommodation, we have to provide a higher specification for the acoustic environment in a bedroom than you would do if you were building a home. So that's something that maybe would be worth looking at if there was a way of increasing and upping the specification, if you like, of houses, so that they become more, you know, in tune with people's needs, their sensory needs. Keeping a quiet environment is really important. So some of the tools we use on projects that I work on are our emotional mapping tool, where we look at how people will feel and react in a space. So this is at the design phase of a building. We would invite people to come and look at the building design with us and say how they might feel in a particular space, and then what we could do to reduce, say, anxiety, or you know, or increase the feeling of calmness within a space. And we then translate that emotional mapping into what would be a sort of a risk assessment, a risk plan. And there's one on the screen at the bottom there, and the red areas on that screen are areas that we know people might be feeling particularly upset or vulnerable or anxious, and they might need a higher specification of materials than in other spaces. And product safety testing is something that has been going on since 2011 in healthcare environments, in that there is this guidance note that has been used for manufacturers and people providing the accommodation, whether it's an NHS trust or a client. They can do their own testing to this standard by and it stipulates in this guidance what tools you should use to stimulate or to simulate, you know, soft body attack or kicking. But these are all very you know, open to interpretation. They are not stringent tests. It depends, you know, how big the person is and how strong the person is hitting a door or a sink or something with a mallet, as to how much damage they do. So that's a problem that is sort of ongoing in my sector. But there are things that are happening which I'm quite excited about ways that we might be able to change the testing of materials and components. So I'm a member of the Design in Mental Health Network, and this is a network of people and organisations who come together and look at specific issues and problems and design best design practice across all building types, and share that experience of design with people with lived experience, service users, healthcare professionals, and also architects and interior designers. And we all share our knowledge and try to create design standards and increase the loveliness of the products that might be on the market for particular mental health environments. And these are some of the things that we do: testing, innovation, community engagement, research, and international work. And we also are linked up with academics who produce these publications where they look at all of the evidence and bring it all together in under different topics. So you can see there's one there about sound, one about art, and one about nature. And these are really good books that if you're a member of the network, you can access, and it gives you all of the latest thinking and research on these different topics. You can become a member of the Design and Mental Health Network for free, so you can sign up, and we have a conference every year, once a year, and there's lots of interesting talks and also products on display that may be suitable for home environments. I know Diane goes around and has a look at it each year and talks to the suppliers to see what might be suitable for the specific homes she's designing. But the newest initiative that the Design and Mental Health Network are starting is called Informed Choices, and this is about a new testing regime developed in tandem with the building research establishment for safety and robustness of products. And we're quite excited about this, that we think this will take these existing products that we've got and give them a certification to a certain level of safety that hasn't been available before. And all of this product testing will be done and certified by the BRE, and it should give us a sort of end up with a catalogue of components that we know have been tested, and particularly for robustness, because we know that, as we've seen with Diane's slides, that if people can just damage things, then it presents new safety risks. It can also mean that we've then got the increased costs of having to replace those things. I won't read out all of this, but basically the Informed Choices have developed a robustness testing using the anthropometric, I can't say that, data used by NASA's Human Performance Research Group to develop the testing, which goes from level 1 to level 5 on the screen here. So a product that had been tested to ROB 5 would be really, really robust. And what they say about ROB 5 is that the large heavy body impact is designed to represent a shoulder barge from an individual with the speed of Usain Bolt and the build of an American football player. So pretty rigorous. So within home environments, there are obviously the added challenges of that we've got to have to think about robustness, but also safety, and also making it a lovely therapeutic environment and not filling it with ugly institutional products. And this is where I think the Informed Choices could help, in that hopefully we will get products that will come onto the market that are lovely and you could have in your home. You might even want them in your home, never mind that they are a specialist product. When we look at products for the home environment, as Richard said earlier, the building envelope should be something that is pretty easy to make robust, and you wouldn't know that it was robust, because we can do wall build-ups and ceiling build-ups and floors and finishes that can't be punched and kicked and end up with damage. So that is something that could be done if you have the right specification. And similarly, external doors, windows, the right glass specification, and even down to some sanitary ware, that could be an easy thing that could be developed for the home environment. There's a robust spec that you wouldn't actually know was a specialist spec. And then on the other side, you've got those bespoke components, the things that people want to have in their home that means that they can personalize it. And this is where the products testing with the BRE Informed Choices might come in that hopefully not immediately, but in a few years, we would have bathroom fittings and bedroom furniture, radiator covers that had been tested, and we can end up with a catalogue of components that can be chosen from. Diane, do you just want to talk about this? This is where we've got the right specification but wrong installation on your blinds.
Yeah, and I think these are just two really classic examples we had, where we had a very good spec, we thought, with a lot of agreement with all involved parties. And then we realised on our first site visit that the people who were project managing just hadn't really understood what we were trying to communicate as a robust specification. So the person I was working with was very light sensitive, had a lot of issues around sleep. And so we decided to spend quite a lot of money on getting some really good blinds. And when we did the visit, these should have been fitted on the exterior of the person's bedroom window, and we found they'd been fitted on the interior. And that it's just how things can go wrong at various stages. And the stones, the person loved throwing. They absolutely, one of their favourite things is throwing. And these, when we did a visit around the garden, for some reason they designed these kind of, I think there's a technical term for them. Is it
Gabion?
Yeah.
Gabion.
With bits of wire sticking out. So there were loads of risks around the person getting cut or hurt. but also there was quite a busy road behind that. So we had visions of these rocks then being thrown, not in anger or distress, but just because it would have been a fun thing to do, and potentially then hitting a car or a person walking by. So those are things that shouldn't have gone wrong, that did go wrong, that did delay this person moving into their home. So those were just two examples of, even when we have the spec, not being able to be really clear about this needs to be this spec, and everybody understanding it along that process where things can go wrong, and ends up delaying people leaving hospital, and also it adds to costs that we don't really need to spend. So,
Yeah, so we're nearly at the end. I know we're on our half an hour, so
yeah,
this is just to sum up, you know, how we think, you know, the product testing could be something that could help trust and care providers. You know, we would love to end up with a catalogue of components, and you could choose some in some instances you might want something that's super robust, but you know, in others you might not need that. But it would help simplify specification and hopefully create a consistent and shared language on what we mean by robust, because we can say it's ROB 5 or ROB 1, and then, you know, we're not ending up with the wrong things in the or the right things in the wrong place, fitted incorrectly. And then we can just also, it will hopefully mean that we're less likely to have products that are damaged and that can create, you know, end up being used to harm people, and hopefully reduce costs. So this is just a plea that if you found this informed choices information interesting, and you think you would like to get on board with it, then you can get in contact with me or the Design and Mental Health Network. And what we're really aiming for is that every single NHS mental health trust across the country pledges to only use products that have been tested in their new buildings and refurbishment projects, and that will put pressure onto the marketplace to come up with products that are safe, but also that look really nice and homely and aren't ugly. So that's a plea from me. Diane, do you just want to just sum up?
Yeah, we've just put some links in. Really if anybody wants to look at the Safe Home Environment tool, it's free to access. And we are looking at doing different versions of this at the moment. We're doing another potential co-production, because it was developed with adults with learning disability in mind, and there's been some, you know, interest in develop a different, more neurodivergent version actually. So, but it's there if you want to see it. And also there's a link there to the work we did with our Experts by Experience about the home project. So that's there as well if you wanted to see some of the things that they thought were important to them.
And finally, there's just the links there to the Design and Mental Health Network and informed choices. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for what was an absolute wealth of information, and so much to think about and take away. So thank you so much. Before we go to questions and comments, I'd really like to welcome our sort of final contributor. Graeme Jackson is Head of Investment and Development at Advanced Housing and Support, and has kindly agreed to be on a panel to support the discussion for the next sort of 45 minutes. And Graeme, I know you've got many years of experience of delivering housing for people with a range of needs, including sensory and other environmental needs, and including for people who require a bespoke and a robust design. Do you have any kind of initial reflections on any of the discussions so far, right? Either William's story and also Karen and Diane's comments and information.
Yeah, no, thank you, Claire. Yeah, I think just echoing what you said, the wealth of knowledge, both from people with lived experience through to Diane and Karen, who obviously have done a lot of work in assessments, in design, and in absolute delivery of some very good end homes for people. It's great that is out there, and it really is important that we all tap into that knowledge and experience. But I think from both presentations, it was very, very obvious and really good to hear that you started with the person, with an individual, and you concentrated and knew that there was a person at the center of it all. It's so easy for you to sort of think, great, there's some wonderful products out there, and let's get those into a house, or let's develop with that, but forgetting that there's a person, and forgetting that might work for one person. But I think it was, as Jules was saying, and Jill as well, people are very different, and it's really, really important, as you've all described, to work with that individual, to work with people who have a knowledge of them, who know them well, so that you can get it as right as possible from the start. And I think it was really interesting in Jules and Richard talking about William, how over time things have changed. And I think it's really important that the environment needs to change to support the person, to allow them to grow, as Jules was saying, to give them enough risk and stimulation, knowing that it won't always go right, and things do need to change back, and other things need to be tried, but just to give people the space to grow, really. And the other thing that was really clear from Jules was about space, and I think Jill mentioned it a lot as well, space and light. I mean, thinking back on what they were saying, where William was put at the very start of his journey, so to speak. I mean, in a room where people were looking at him through a observation hatch. I mean, that must just have been dreadful. And yet when he was able to move into his own home, they designed it so there was much more space, and that there was stimulation. And Jules was very, very clear that to put too much stimulation there all at once would have been detrimental. But they've changed the environment over time, and let William have the ability to sort of choose what he wants around him, putting stickers on the wall, taking off some of that padding so that he can have that, as they describe, those sort of hard points, those firm points where he can regulate and know by pressing down what that means. And we excuse me, we've also used the Safe Homes Environment tool, which has been really good, and it, as you were saying, Diane, it just really enables you to look at what works, what hasn't worked, and what could work in the future. So, and it's really important that, again, getting people together who know the person and absolutely involving the person as much as possible from the very start. And from what you were saying, Karen, just being able to move forwards with some of those products that may be very robust at the moment, may be pretty ugly, but working with individuals, working with people who are going to have these in their own homes, and so working with them to design them so anybody might want them in their own homes, and it doesn't stick out to be, again, what you were saying, sort of from homely to institutional. We all want to make sure that people are happy and able to live as fulfilled a life as possible in their own home, but make them as homely and welcoming as possible. But understanding that, as you were saying, Diane, giving somebody too much all at once might be completely wrong for them. And so it was really interesting what you were saying about that kitchen. Can you build up little bits at a time so that it actually enables somebody to, as William was described, going into the kitchen to make himself a sandwich? but without overstimulation, so people don't then take that kitchen apart. So yeah, it gave me a lot to think about, because we try to design everything in at the very start, but why not add to it over time? So no, it was a wealth of experience and knowledge, both, as I say, from people with lived experience to those who are designing and changing things and retrofitting and all those kind of things all the time.
Thank you. Those are really useful and thought-provoking reflections. Really appreciate it. So we're going to go to our Q&A session now, and we've already got a couple of questions. We have quite a specific question first, Karen and Diane, which is about the emotional mapping tool. Is that tool and process transferable to people who are working with people in their own home as part of adapting or retrofitting a property? I don't know if either of you want to kind of just comment on that.
Well, the emotional mapping tool is something that our research and development director, Richard Mazook, designed quite a number of years ago now, when we used to be called, for those of you that are quite old, you might know that you might have heard of Nightingale Associates. We were architects specialising in healthcare, and then we were bought by IBI, and now we're bought by Arcadis. But we've been around for quite a long time. And that tool has been used by us when we're working on new buildings. I haven't personally used it on, you know, on a home environment, but I don't see any reason why it couldn't be. It's not a sort of app, if you like. It's not something that you can just use really quickly. It would need, you know, a bit of training possibly to understand how you might use it in a home. But you know, I'm open to suggestions about how it could be used. So whoever that is who's written that's. And I want to have a chat about it. Yeah,
I think it came about as well, not the actual tool, but because I was saying to Karen, one of the reasons I think going to a health architect can be really helpful is you understand things like when we talk about wanting trauma informed and what a psychological safe space might look for somebody who might have experienced quite restrictive, you know, a lot of restrictions, as we heard about William when they've been in a hospital. Understanding when we try and say how we want a home to feel very different for them, but understanding that language, it doesn't, when you say that to a standard architect, they look at you like it's something they've never thought of, where of course that's language that's very pertinent to you, isn't it? You understand that we're looking for something very different when we're trying to create a home for somebody, but bearing in mind some of the kind of experiences that, like you're saying about William living in one tiny room, how you then kind of build a home that will feel like a home for somebody. So I know that's one of the things we talk a bit about, don't we, sometimes when we meet, Karen?
Yes. But I don't know if your share tool would be more would be something that people, you know, looking at their own home and retrofitting, adapting a property. It's a sort of similar thing, isn't it? But it might be easier to use.
Well, we've actually got a comment on the share tool. So Caroline has said that Caroline's been using the share tool for a while and found it really useful, which is good to hear. And the wider comment that for occupational therapists in a learning disability setting and in community and inpatient, this is such a growing area, and Caroline's found the information in these sessions really useful, which is really good to hear, and looking for guidance and resources and evidence. And actually that's kind of, I think just linked to that, I wondered what either of you kind of on the panel, do you have any thoughts about what would be the information guidance that would be most useful to people working in this area kind of going forward? What's missing? I mean, you've shared some really good resources that are available, but what do you think people, whether it's a housing provider, whether it's the architect, whether it's the commissioner, whether it's the family, what do you think's missing in terms of information that people might want? Don't know if anyone's got any thoughts.
I only have a very quick one, because I think we've learned by what's gone wrong when we've been developing some of the work we've done. And I think I learned very quickly that we had to go outside. You know, you have to know what your skill set is, and then know where the other people are that you need around you when you're designing something. And I think I learned that there's not one person who's got all the answers, but sometimes getting the right skills in the right place is really important. And even sometimes I've had to ring up the guys, I work in a mental health trust, from our estates team, and say, right, can you give me some advice about a door? We're having all these kind of issues, and they'll say, it's a, you know, an inpatient house. No, no, it's a house. We've got a house, but we're kind of having to borrow from different fields to kind of sometimes get it right for somebody. But that's my only thought.
Thank you. That's really useful. Graeme, do you feel that from a kind of housing provider point of view, there's a good source of information that you can go to for the information that you need to participate in the kind of co-design process?
I think there's certainly information out there, but I think, as Diane says, you often have to go to people, areas that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And I think it's what Karen was saying with the informed choice, that product catalogue, for want of a better sort of phrase, would be really useful. So often in the safe home environment, we're told it needs to be this kind of design, or this works really well for somebody. But it can be quite difficult to then find a product that fits. Examples even to sort of linear drains that are anti-ligature. I mean, all that kind of thing, which is there, but what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And you sometimes actually have to go and get it purpose made, because nobody's done it before. So to have a sort of product catalogue would be really useful. And then I suppose it's a shared understanding of what some of the descriptions mean. And we talked a lot about what does robust mean, but there are lots of other phrases that are used. And as Diane was saying, you can talk to an architect who probably designs a wonderful building, but doesn't necessarily know the language that you're talking. And hopefully we wouldn't quite do what was done for you, Diane, get the blinds on the inside rather than the outside. But I can see how that can happen. So it's just making sure that everybody is talking at the same level about the same things, and really having a good understanding, because sometimes trying to translate what maybe the team, including the individual, are talking about and understand, but translating that to a contractor or a developer, you can lose very much in that translation. And so what they think you mean and what they put in, again, a bit like the radiator and the radiator cover, they've probably come across, oh yeah, we'll have a really robust cover over a radiator, but no, you don't want radiators, they have to be underfloor heating. So it's just making sure that everybody knows what you're saying and sort of talking about. And there is a lot of information out there, but it's going to people who have done it before. And if there were that pool of information that you could go to just to find out, this is what we were able to do, this didn't work, but this worked afterwards. So, and then it just saves cost, time, delays, and real upset and anxiety for the person who wants to live in their home. Because I think for us, if we get it, if it goes wrong, where is somebody able to move to have a safe home whilst we're putting theirs right?
Thank you. That's really helpful. We're getting quite a lot of comments, questions through it now, which is great. Thank you very much to Eve, and you've shared your personal experience as a mum whose son has been in hospital for over 3 years. It's so overwhelming. Where do I start? Who do I contact to get the ball rolling, as my local authority isn't responsive to this idea because of the lack of support and housing in the community? Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any kind of initial thoughts for Eve, kind of on that sort of challenge that she's facing.
suppose from our experience, it is working with the Integrated Care Board. Certainly if somebody's, if your son's coming from hospital, then they would be a first port of call. I mean, it's not easy. There certainly aren't properties necessarily out there that are vacant that can be used straight away. And there is a lack of capital funding. So all those at a higher level need to be sorted out as well. Although that doesn't necessarily help you in your personal situation.
I suppose I'll just add to that, just sort of thinking as you're talking, it is difficult, isn't it? I guess the reason I've got the role I've got is because there is such a big challenge around housing. We need more housing in the community, and I suppose I would say it's worth having a look at if your son's in hospital, having a look at the brick by brick guidance which NHS England published last year. It's not mandatory, but it describes the process at a high level that should be happening to support people to plan for their future housing needs. And there's a suggestion that really that planning should happen from the point that the person is admitted to hospital, if not before, if it's a planned admission. And that there's a kind of assumption in brick by brick that this is what people should be able to expect, that people should be able to expect to live in their own home, albeit we know all of the challenges that areas are facing around that. So it's worth reading that, even if it's just to kind of give you a sense of perhaps the people who might be involved in putting that pathway together, the kinds of processes that ideally should be happening, the conversations, and some of the sort of talking points, the kind of questions that you might be able to ask. I hope that's helpful in terms of kind of where you could look for sort of a bit more information. And I will also have a think about whether there's any other useful information we could post in the Q&A that might give you a bit of a kind of starting point around that. We have a comment from Karen, just noting that the references and information have been helpful, and that you've made some notes, and the slides will be shared as well. So, but within our service, we struggle to get anyone to lead on developing suitable environments where people are dysregulated, potentially because of an unsuitable environment or support. They're viewed as a health responsibility and referred for continuing healthcare funding. Continuing healthcare takes some point of not being responsible for housing and direct that back to the local authority, who respond with their typical housing stock or emergency accommodation. Do you have any advice or top tips for progressing things? I mean, I'm not a member of the panel, but I suppose the way that we would recommend areas should be taking this forward, that is sort of set out in that brick by brick process that we would hope that people will be looking at and perhaps thinking about reviewing their process. And brick by brick suggests that the starting point could be a kind of protocol at the ICB level, jointly with the local authority, that kind of agrees the principles to kind of prevent some of those barriers and blocks, and to kind of promote some kind of joint working. I don't know, Diane and Graeme, I don't know if you've got any experience of working in areas where that is working really well, and kind of what the qualities of that working well might look like, or what people should be looking out for if that is happening well. Diane?
I don't know, to be honest. What I would say is I really like the forums you put on if people don't know that and haven't joined them, because that does give really nice examples, doesn't it, where different areas are doing different schemes and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I found I've learned a lot from that about really positive things that are happening across the country. So that might be a really good link if people don't know about those, Claire.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
So the National Housing Community of Practice is something which we run at least every 2 months, sometimes a little bit more. And it's a joint forum for everyone who's interested in housing for people with learning disability and autistic people. So it's very broad. And we will be talking about design later in the year a little bit more, because it's definitely one of the top topics people are interested in. But the kind of issue you've raised there, Karen, we have talked about that quite a lot at previous sessions, not with necessarily any easy answers, because there aren't any, but we do try to address these issues head on. Right, next comment from Daryl. We successfully support many individuals from hospital settings and registered care homes in their own communities. When creating an environment, the CQC want the environment to be normal. Also, before registering the service, they don't want you to have committed to specific individuals as the service has not been registered yet. Therefore, specialist adaptations are often required following registration. What is your experience of this, and do you have any advice? I don't know if any of the panelists have any experience of that interplay with CQC, and if you've got any kind of thoughts on that that issue.
Most of the people we're working with, we would offer a tenancy to, right? I mean, they're not registered establishments. So the support service would probably be CQC registered, but the environment itself isn't. And I know there are standards that need to be delivered and developed to, but they wouldn't be an establishment as such. It would be an ordinary residence.
I think the focus of these webinars has been kind of housing, really. I think reflecting the feedback we get from a lot of the people with lived experience that we work with, that many people most aspire to living in their own home and having a place of their own. I'm not saying that care homes, can't be a good solution for some people, but that our focus has been on sort of housing solutions. But I'm sure some of the good practice around design are equally relevant to care homes. And it feels as if the conversation with CQC might be a useful kind of almost a useful separate conversation, because some of those sequencing issues clearly can be a challenge. So perhaps that's something we need to make a note of, and it might be useful to kind of come back to at a future session, unless anyone else would like to kind of add your response to that question. So we have a question about somebody who's developing a children's home for children and young people who are autistic and or have a learning disability. Is the Share tool adult only, or can it be used with children? Don't know whether that's something you'd like to comment on, Diane.
I got asked that very question this morning. So I'm meeting with some of my colleagues working in CAMS actually to look at it. I think the thing is, it's a pragmatic tool, and I think maybe you can look at it. It's free access. Just email me and I'll send you the link. There might be elements you can take out of it that might be useful. So it's definitely. Somebody asked me what the evidence base was with children, and I said, well, there isn't any, because it was really designed quite specifically for an issue we were facing clinically. But I think there might be elements to think about in there that you might find useful. So send me a link and I can send you it. So
thank you, that's really useful. So we've got a comment from Sarah. Great presentations, and lovely to see the way homes are being developed for people for their specific needs. Actually, yes, an important question about design for transitional crisis and step-down housing. So where something might be designed for somebody who might only be there for a short time, and then it would need to be suitable for the next person. So may not know who's going to be living there at the point of design. Don't know whether, Karen, you might have any thoughts about that from a sort of design perspective.
Hi, yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's probably a sort of similar issue that we have when we're designing inpatient hospital accommodation, because we do have people who are only there for a short period of time, or sometimes they're there for a number of months or even years, but we do have to design it so that it can be flexible and be changed. So in the presentation I was talking about creating the building envelope as a standard sort of specified robust design, and then you can, if you have that shell, if you like, that has been designed to a certain specification, you can then add those elements of personalization into a space. So that can be easy things like allowing things to be stuck on the walls, or their own bedding, or soft furnishings, but it can also mean maybe the room gets painted a certain color, or and that you can change the color on the walls or even the flooring, but maybe you don't change the kitchen units, you don't change the bathroom, but you can bring those elements of personalization into a new home or a new space relatively cheaply.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We've just got some useful information that Foundations are just about to launch a new piece of guidance on the Disabled Facilities Grant, which is should be on the website, the Foundations website tomorrow. And so Foundations is the National Delivery Agency for Home Improvement Agencies, and in particular have a lot of expertise around the Disabled Facilities Grant, which is obviously really important source of funding for people who need adaptations to their own homes, particularly when it's sort of retrofitting, so they already live there. So thank you for that. That's really useful. We've got a comment about the challenges in London, and I guess it's true. It's both in terms of the environment and the housing location. It's really tricky in places where there's high housing costs and not enough land. So I think it's true in lots of places, but London in particular is really, really tricky. And having often to go out of London for a a good location. I don't know whether, Karen, have you worked in London? Do you have any experience of designing in a kind of an environment like London with those challenges?
Not necessarily from a housing perspective, but from a mental health inpatient hospitals perspective, and we do have the issue of space, and what we've had to do on new buildings that we've been designing in London is build up. So it was interesting hearing about what Richard and Jules were saying, that having that space, is really, really important. And yeah, I haven't designed housing in London, but I think it's probably a similar issue, that the cost of land is so high, and we're limited on space, so we're limited on outside space, and we all know how beneficial being outside is. So
yeah,
yes,
thank you.
very difficult subject. I don't know how we solve it.
No easy answers to that one. We've got a really helpful comment about from somebody working in the educational sector, wanting to find out how to incorporate these lessons from the discussion in the curriculum teaching undergraduate architecture students, which I think everybody on this call would be really, really excited to see that happening more. Karen, do you think the Design and Mental Health Network would be a good place to start in terms of that?
Yes, definitely. That we have links with London South Bank University, who do the wonderful documents. I've got one here that I was showing, the research booklets, and there's various people doing PhDs about different aspects of design and in relation to mental health and learning disabilities. So yes, definitely is something. If Olatunde, if you want to get in touch, we can probably link you up with somebody.
That sounds very, very interesting and potentially productive. So yes, thank you so much. We have an interesting comment from Martin, an occupational therapist, 5 months into a role working with some service users, and actually the catalogue of products would be really useful. But also, what about a sort of actual environmental checklist to work through to help me to think about specifications I may need to consider with potential ideas, something I could work through with informal and formal carers and other professionals. I've used the SHEAR tool, which was useful in identifying risk and evidence, but will be useful to help me find solutions. Just before I bring in anyone else, I know that I've got a couple of colleagues in NHS England who are working on something like this to support the NHS capital funding programme. I'm not leading on the work, so I don't know the detail, but I know that there is some work going on to support that. And I think there's definitely, and maybe when we kind of wrap up, it will be good to kind of highlight where we might take this forward, how we might bring some of this really good stuff together, because it feels as if there is some really useful stuff happening, but perhaps not very joined up at the moment. So I don't know whether anyone on the panel has come across anything like that already in terms of that sort of solution focus, specification, support.
It's Diane here. We've been doing some work on what we call a site visit tool, only because we often get asked to go around and look at potential properties and then can that be converted is often the question we get. So we've been doing some really just kind of some very basic work that often we have to take to court of protection, and so it has to be ready, it has to be in a format that can be understood by a lot of people. But sometimes it's about going around a property and saying, okay, this might need doing, these are the things we've spotted. And then lots of people, I'm doing one with a parent at the moment in terms of, can you think about, you know, how could we improve this? What are the potential problems? I got shown a house not long ago where my person who loved water, they were suggesting he move into a property where there was a swimming pool next door and there was only I think it was something like a 4 metre, it wasn't a very high fence, and we couldn't do anything about that because of planning. And all I could see was if I was him, I'd be over that fence in that swimming pool in a blink of an eye. So sometimes it's trying to map, well, this could be a suitable house, but what is going on in the environment? How close are we to roads? Where's the schools? All those kind of things. So we have done a bit of basic work on that, but more on a case by case kind of scenario, really.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And just sort of to, I suppose, some useful responses you've had on a couple of these points. So Fred has commented that it might be a catalogue which pulls products from a range of manufacturers, along with some design principles in relation to what a good basic environment would look like, which could then be tailored to the individual through a process of addition. So that's kind of that's a comment on kind of wrapping up some of the comments we've made. Fred's made another comment, which I'll come back to perhaps when we finish this bit. And Moira has just pointed out the Residential Environmental Impact Scale, REIS, from MOHO is a useful tool for OTs to use as a checklist. So I don't know whether or not it's...
And
would you recommend that, Diane?
and the reason, yeah, we use that alongside our SHEAR. It's good one in terms of we kind of borrow from lots of different schools actually when we're thinking about environment. So yeah.
Right, we had a specific question, Karen, I think, from Sue. What size requirements for homes should we be looking for best practice? National Described Space Standards or larger or smaller? So what design guidance do you use, Karen?
Hi, if it's relation to homes, I would have to check with my colleague who is a specialist in supported living, because I'm more of a specialist in healthcare and mental health. So yes, I'm sorry, I can't answer that right now, but I could probably find out for you or put you in touch with somebody who will be able to answer that one.
Thank you.
I think we suggest always going higher than nationally described space standards. It's just, yeah, because if you've got a 1-bed flat at 39 square meters, that's not really going to be spacious. And it's more about how you design the inside as well, because I think Diane was saying, yeah, open plan, it doesn't always work. So whilst the NDSS is a good starting point and you've got to achieve that for new build, yeah, we'd always look to hopefully go above that.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I think I would echo that. I think in terms of our programme, we would always be looking for higher than as well. There's been a really helpful response on CQC that you can talk to registration team at CQC prior to putting in an application to register, be it care homes or supported living, to talk about the application. And they have a specialist registration team for services for autistic people and people with a learning disability. So I wanted to come back as a kind of final question, which is something that Fred raised, and I was thinking about it as well. This issue that was raised in the call with William about where the importance of good support alongside design. And I suppose I wanted to ask any of the panel really the extent to which we sometimes confuse the primary issue as being to do with the housing specification, or, versus the quality of the support, or vice versa, if we're not really understanding what the person's communicating about their needs or their concerns or their what they require. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that kind of trade-off, or that kind of how to get that sort of to really understand a person, and whether it's to do with support or design or both.
I think it's absolutely crucial to understand why you might. I mean, I know I tend to work with people where there's been quite specific concerns, but I had a very similar conversation yesterday around somebody requested us to go to a shear for somebody in their own home where there'd been a lot of damage. And my big question is why are you seeing this? And unless you actually understand the function of that behaviour and what's going wrong. And I've seen excellent care actually in absolutely shocking buildings, but there's no doubt it makes it easier for everybody if you've got a well-designed building. You know, it shouldn't be, sometimes it shouldn't be about that trade-off. We should be aiming to have very, very good support in place for somebody, and also in a building that's fit for purpose. So it's a combination of all of that, I think.
And I suppose just following on from that, we often hear people talking about the challenges of how to avoid creating. I mean, you hear the phrase hospital in the community, which is perhaps sometimes when we're not quite sure what the specification should be, so we over specify, or perhaps some of the people involved in supporting that people to be discharged may be very worried about their safety, so we can end up with quite a sort of I think Richard was talking about how we sometimes, if we manage the risk so restrictively, that people don't have opportunities to grow. Graeme, I don't know whether you've got any experience of kind of working as part of a team to kind of manage that transition so that people do have space to grow, and balancing that out.
Yeah, I think it's I think Jill was saying this as well. It's sort of that culture and relationships are more important than the building. And Karen was mentioning how you can design, adapt, alter a property to have the basic robustness, and you don't have to go over the top so it becomes too restrictive. I mean, we've certainly seen where people have very, very high ratios of support, and that can cause its own issues within a house, within a home. And yeah, we need to be careful that if we are being told to put in areas where somebody can't go for what are viewed as good reasons, that there are actually good reasons behind that, because that could be quite restrictive as well. And whilst there can be good reasons to not overload somebody initially, that should always be reviewed. And I mean, obviously there are regulatory and other ways of doing things through court of protection, but yes, it really is important to have an environment that is conducive to, as you were saying, Claire, to enable somebody to grow. And I think, as Richard was saying, each time he saw William, there was more of William. It's sort of getting that balance, but understanding that things may not always work. And we do have to go back and replace things, change things. There's a cost to that, there's disruption to that, but ultimately, if that's going to enable somebody to grow and become the person who they want to be and can be, then it's a small price, and not always easy to get that through to those who have to pay the bill at the end of the day. But it's that, again, it's that seesaw that Karen showed. It's that sort of balancing act between what the environment is like, but knowing that it has to be therapeutic and right for the individual.
Thank you, that's really helpful. We have one last question, which we've only got a couple of minutes. So Karen, I just wondered whether you could kind of just have a quick comment in response to this question, which is about, do you have a more bespoke defects periods when doing new builds? This is somebody who normally works in community housing and finds really struggle to adapt new build properties. So do you have any kind of quick thoughts about accommodating the idea of building the envelope, but then needing to adapt further?
I think, yeah, I don't know if this is about, the question is about if somebody moves out and then you've got somebody new moving in, and how quickly you can, change that property. Is that what Ash is asking?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
So the point is to get the building envelope right, the bits that you wouldn't want to change, like the windows, the doors, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, have a robust, but nice kitchen, and the bathroom fixtures and fittings, and then depending on how quick your turnover is of people, you sort of need to have a sliding scale, I guess, of things that are quick to change, and that and then things that maybe take a bit longer, like painting the walls. You might need a few days or a week, say, to repaint somewhere for someone to move in. But if it was just changing the soft furnishings, or putting some new pictures up on the wall, that's an easier thing to do. If you've got that shell that isn't going to get damaged, hopefully, and it is there as the background, then you can use that to dress a property and make it individual. I don't know if that's answered the question.
No, thank you. We only had a couple of minutes, so it's tricky, but really appreciate it. Thank you. So just a final couple of thoughts we wrap up, and I'll hand over to Becca just to sort of thank everybody. I think it does feel like there's some really, really good sources of expertise and advice and information, but it's probably quite hard to find some of it and to kind of put it together and to understand how it all joins up. And I've learned about some things today that I didn't know about. I didn't know about the BRE work, because that sounds incredibly relevant, for example. So it feels like we're in an exciting place. There's feels like there's a lot happening, and we could bring it, we could bring some of it together by working collaboratively. Please do join the Housing Community Practice if you're interested in kind of being part of ongoing discussions about all of these issues. Thank you for everyone who's put links and other useful information in the chat, which quite a lot of people have. So that's brilliant. And we'll definitely make sure that we share all of that. I think other than that, thank you so much. And I'll just hand over to Becca to thank everyone on behalf of ND Connection. But it's been great being able to work on this alongside colleagues at Neurodiverse Connection. Thank you.
Oh, thank you all so much. It's been such an interesting and rich Q&A session. So thank you very much, Karen, Diane and Graeme. And thank you to everyone, all the people who attended and fed into that Q&A as well. It's great to see that engagement. And also a thank you, of course, to Jules, Richard and Jill for producing that sort of very beautiful, raw reflection on the work that they've all done with William and for William. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And I hope that you go away and don't melt too much in this rather glorious heat that we are all, well, I imagine we are all having. So take care and thank you very much.